The midnight air cuts through Manhattan streets like a blade of truth. A woman falls to her knees on the cold pavement, her tears catching the harsh glow of a street lamp. "Don't cry, Mom," she whispers to the darkness, her voice breaking like glass against stone. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're serving tables, polishing glasses, or waiting for someone to say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will shake your heart. The restaurant behind her glows with warmth she'll never feel again, its golden windows reflecting a world that has just cast her out. Steam rises from manholes like the city's own tears, mixing with the distant hum of late-night traffic. In this moment of absolute despair, when dignity meets devastation, a figure emerges from those same golden doors. A man in a suit worth more than she's ever made in a year, his footsteps echoing against wet concrete as he approaches her broken form. This is the story of Marlene Rodriguez, a woman whose hands have served thousands, but whose heart has been seen by none. And Jonathan Pierce, the tech millionaire whose Bitcoin fortune couldn't buy him what he discovered that night on a sidewalk outside Enzo's Italian kitchen. The morning had started like any other for Marlene. Her alarm shrieked at 4:47 a.m. in her studio apartment in Washington Heights, where the radiator clanged its metal symphony and thin walls carried her neighbor's baby's cries. She'd learned to dress in the dark, her movements practiced and silent, slipping into the black pants and white blouse that had become her second skin. The subway ride downtown was a meditation of exhaustion. Fluorescent lights flickering overhead as she watched her reflection in the dirty windows, a woman of 43 who looked older, carrying invisible weight in her shoulders. Enzo's Italian kitchen occupied a prime corner of Midtown, its brass fixtures and marble floors speaking of money that flowed like wine to those who could afford $70 steaks. Marlene had worked there for 8 years, long enough to know every creak of the floorboards, every temperamental quirk of the espresso machine, every shadow that fell across table 12 when the afternoon sun hit just right. Her hands, scarred from countless burns and cuts, moved through her morning routine with the precision of a surgeon, folding napkins, polishing glasses until they caught light like diamonds, arranging flowers that cost more than her monthly Metro card. The other servers called her Mom, not from affection, but because she was the oldest, the one who remembered everyone's birthday, who stayed late to help close, who never complained when difficult customers demanded her section be cleaned again. She carried their respect like loose change in her pocket, present, but never quite enough. Her real world existed in the spaces between service, stolen moments in the staff bathroom where she'd check her phone for messages from her mother in Puerto Rico, whose medication costs more each month. Brief calls during smoke breaks where she'd wire another $100 she couldn't spare, her voice steady even as her bank balance dwindled. The other servers saw her smile, heard her laugh at their jokes, watched her glide between tables with impossible grace. They never saw the woman who counted pills at 3 a.m. to make sure her mother had enough, who chose between heating and eating, who carried photos of a daughter she'd lost to foster care 15 years ago when life crumbled faster than she could rebuild it. The lunch rush at Enzo's was controlled chaos, the kind that separated experienced servers from those who'd quit by Wednesday. Marlene moved through it like a dancer, balancing 4 plates up her left arm while her right hand poured wine, her memory holding 16 orders without writing a single note. The kitchen's heat mixed with garlic and basil created an atmosphere that was both hellish and heavenly, sweat beading on her forehead as she navigated between tables filled with business executives closing million-dollar deals between courses. That's when she first noticed him, Jonathan Pierce, though she wouldn't learn his name for months. He sat alone at table 7 every Tuesday and Thursday, always ordering the same thing: medium rare ribeye, no vegetables, black coffee, and a single glass of Cabernet that he'd nurse for an hour while typing on his phone. He was handsome in the way wealthy men often are, not naturally beautiful, but polished to a shine that spoke of personal trainers and Italian tailors. His watch caught the restaurant's warm lighting, its platinum face probably worth more than her annual salary. But what struck Marlene wasn't his obvious wealth. She served plenty of rich customers. It was his eyes. Behind designer glasses, they held a grief so profound it made her own heart ache. She'd seen that look before. In her bathroom mirror after the courts took her daughter away. It was the expression of someone trying to hold together pieces that no longer fit. Jonathan Pierce had built his fortune in the volatile world of cryptocurrency and tech investments, his company's algorithms processing millions in Bitcoin transactions daily. His net worth fluctuated by more money than most people saw in a lifetime, numbers on screens that represented years of 18-hour days and calculated risks. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, 43 floors above the city where people like Marlene lived and worked. He owned properties in 3 countries, held stocks in companies whose names began with numbers and could afford anything money could buy. Except peace. Except sleep that came without nightmares. Except the ability to look at his 2 teenage children without seeing Rebecca's eyes staring back at him, reminding him daily of the wife who died in a car accident 5 years ago while he was in a board meeting, too important to answer her final phone call. The accident had been sudden. Black ice on the Henry Hudson Parkway, her car sliding into the median at 60 miles an hour. By the time he reached the hospital, machines were breathing for her, and doctors were using words like extensive trauma and quality of life. He'd made the hardest decision of his existence in a sterile waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams, signing papers that felt like admitting defeat. His children, Emma and Michael, had never forgiven him. Not for the decision, they understood that, but for the years of distance that followed, the way grief had turned him into a ghost in his own home. He provided for them lavishly, guilt money flowing through private school tuitions and designer clothes, but he'd forgotten how to be their father, forgotten how to be human. Work became his sanctuary and his prison. The predictable world of algorithms and profit margins made sense when nothing else did. He'd arrive at his office by 6 a.m. and leave after midnight, sometimes sleeping on the leather couch in his corner office, rather than returning to a house that echoed with Rebecca's absence. His assistant managed his calendar, his housekeeper managed his home, and his money managed everything else. But Tuesday evenings, something pulled him to Enzo's. Maybe it was the way the warm light fell across the white tablecloths, or the sound of conversation and clinking glasses that filled the space between his ears where silence usually lived. He told himself it was convenient, close to his office, good food. He never admitted that he came to watch life happening around him, to sit at the edges of joy and pretend he remembered how it felt. And there was the waitress, Marlene, he'd learned by listening to other servers call her name. She moved through the restaurant like water, flowing around obstacles, nourishing everything she touched. He watched her calm an angry customer with nothing but patience and a soft smile. Saw her slip an extra dinner roll to an elderly man who ate alone every Friday, counting out exact change from a worn wallet. Noticed how she always asked about people's families, remembering names and details that made strangers feel seen. She served his table with professional courtesy, never intrusive, never overly familiar. But sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, he caught glimpses of something deeper, a weariness that matched his own, a kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. In those moments, he recognized a fellow traveler on the road of loss, though he couldn't imagine what sorrows a waitress might carry. The night that changed everything started like any other Tuesday. Jonathan sat at his usual table, his phone displaying cryptocurrency markets from Tokyo, while his untouched steak grew cold. The restaurant hummed with its typical evening energy. Couples celebrating anniversaries, business partners sealing deals, families making memories over plates of pasta and bottles of wine. Marlene worked her section with practiced efficiency, her smile genuine but distant, her movements economical and graceful. She'd received the call during her break, stepping into the narrow alley behind the restaurant where the dumpsters competed with delivery trucks for space. Her mother's voice, weakened by chemotherapy, barely rose above a whisper. The cancer was spreading faster than expected. The doctors in San Juan wanted to try experimental treatment, but insurance wouldn't cover it. The cost, $80,000, might as well have been $8 million for all Marlene could manage. "Mija," her mother had whispered, using the pet name that always made Marlene feel like a little girl again. "Don't worry about the money. I've lived enough." But Marlene had heard the fear beneath the resignation, the same terror she'd carried in her own voice 15 years ago, when she'd begged social workers for one more chance to keep her daughter. Some fights were worth everything, even when everything wasn't enough. She returned to her tables with steady hands and a breaking heart, serving wine and taking orders while calculating impossible mathematics in her head. Her savings account held $3,000. Her credit cards were maxed from previous medical emergencies. Her second job at the coffee shop brought in another $800 monthly, but even working 7 days a week wouldn't generate enough fast enough. Jonathan noticed the change immediately. Her smile seemed painted on now, her usual fluid grace replaced by movements that were almost robotic. When she refilled his water glass, her hand trembled slightly, and he found himself genuinely concerned, for perhaps the first time in years, about someone outside his immediate circle. The evening took a dramatic turn around 10:30 p.m., when a young woman stumbled through Enzo's heavy glass doors. She couldn't have been more than 22. Her mascara streaked down pale cheeks, her breath coming in shallow gasps that spoke of panic and desperation. The hostess moved to intercept her. This was clearly not a paying customer. But Marlene was faster. "Honey, what's wrong?" Marlene's voice carried the warmth of genuine concern as she approached the girl, her server's apron making her look more like a mother figure than an employee. The young woman looked up with eyes that held the kind of fear Marlene recognized, the look of someone drowning in circumstances beyond their control. "I'm sorry," the girl whispered, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I just need somewhere warm for a minute. I didn't know where else to go." The hostess, a 25-year-old named Jessica, who'd been hired more for her Instagram-worthy appearance than her customer service skills, stepped forward with practiced authority. "Ma'am, this is a private restaurant. If you're not dining with us, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." But Marlene was already guiding the girl toward an empty booth in her section, her movements protective and sure. "Sit down, sweetheart. Let me get you some water and we'll figure this out." Jonathan watched the scene unfold from his corner table, his fingers pausing over his phone screen. The girl was clearly in distress. He could see it in the way her shoulders shook, in the desperate gratitude that flooded her face when Marlene's kindness wrapped around her like a blanket. This wasn't about money or status or the social protocols that governed most interactions in places like Enzo's. This was about simple human decency, and he found himself leaning forward to hear what would happen next. "I lost my job today," the girl confessed between sips of the warm tea Marlene had somehow materialized. "My roommate kicked me out last week when I couldn't make rent. I've been sleeping in my car, but it broke down this afternoon, and the tow truck took it because I couldn't pay the fee. I have $17 and nowhere to go." Marlene's response was immediate and instinctive. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, her tip money from the evening, probably close to $60 in small bills. Without hesitation, she pressed it into the girl's hands. "There's a women's shelter 6 blocks from here," Marlene said, her voice gentle but practical. "This should cover a taxi and a few nights until you can get back on your feet. Do you have family you can call?" The girl's tears came harder now, but they were tears of relief mixed with disbelief. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Marlene's smile carried the weight of her own struggles, her own nights when help had come from unexpected places. "Because someone helped me once when I needed it most. That's how it works. We take care of each other." From across the restaurant, Jonathan felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since Rebecca died. Here was a woman who probably made minimum wage plus tips, working 10-hour days on her feet, and she'd just given away her evening's earnings without a thought for her own needs. The gesture was so foreign to his world of calculated investments and strategic philanthropy that it took his breath away. But Jessica, the hostess, had different concerns. As soon as the young woman left, wrapped in Marlene's old cardigan and carrying directions to the shelter, Jessica was on her phone with the manager. Her voice carried clearly across the restaurant's marble floors and brass fixtures as she reported the incident with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a reason to feel important. "She brought some homeless person inside and gave her money," Jessica explained to whoever was listening. "I told her this wasn't appropriate, but she completely ignored me. We can't have street people thinking they can come in here for handouts." The manager, David Chen, had run Enzo's for 3 years with the kind of by-the-book efficiency that impressed corporate executives and eliminated liability issues. He was a good man, but he'd learned that successful restaurants in Manhattan operated on strict protocols designed to maintain their exclusive atmosphere. Wealthy customers paid premium prices, partly for the assurance that their dining experience wouldn't be disrupted by the harsh realities of urban life outside those brass doors. Within minutes, David was crossing the dining room toward Marlene's station, his expression grave but not unkind. Jonathan found himself straining to hear their conversation, though he couldn't have explained why this mattered to him so much. "Marlene, I need to speak with you privately," David said, his voice carrying the uncomfortable tone of someone about to deliver bad news. "Please finish your current tables and meet me in the office." Marlene's face went still, understanding immediately what was coming. She'd violated unspoken rules about maintaining the restaurant's carefully crafted boundary between server and served, between business and mercy. In the arithmetic of restaurant management, her kindness was a liability that could cost them wealthy customers who came here to escape the very problems she'd just invited inside. She moved through her final tasks with mechanical precision, clearing Jonathan's untouched steak, refilling water glasses, presenting checks with the smile that had become her trademark. But Jonathan could see the defeat settling into her shoulders. The way her movements had lost their earlier grace and become the motions of someone counting down to goodbye. The office conversation was brief and predictable. David explained the restaurant's policies, the importance of maintaining boundaries, the necessity of protecting Enzo's reputation and atmosphere. Marlene listened without arguing, accepting her termination with the same quiet dignity she'd shown in everything else. She understood the business reasons even as her heart broke over the human cost. 20 minutes later, she emerged carrying a small box containing her personal items, a photo of her daughter, the sweater she kept for when the air conditioning ran too cold, a ceramic mug that had been a gift from a co-worker who'd moved away last Christmas. Her apron, the symbol of 8 years of service, had been left folded on David's desk like a white flag of surrender. The restaurant fell strangely quiet as she walked toward the exit, her co-workers caught between sympathy and self-preservation. A few offered sad smiles, but no one spoke up in her defense. Jobs at upscale restaurants were too precious to risk over principle, especially for someone whose shift was already over. Jonathan watched her leave through the tall windows that faced the street, his ribeye forgotten, his phone calls unanswered. Something about the sight of her small figure walking away into the Manhattan night struck him as profoundly wrong, like watching someone destroy a work of art because they couldn't identify the artist. That's when he saw her fall. The sidewalk outside Enzo's was unforgiving concrete, worn smooth by millions of footsteps but hard as judgment when knees met stone. Marlene didn't collapse dramatically. There was no theatrical throwing of arms or crying out to the sky. Instead, she simply sank down beside a street lamp, her small box of belongings clutched against her chest, and let the tears she'd held back finally come. "Don't cry, Mom," she whispered to the night air, though she was thousands of miles from the woman who'd given her life and whose own life now hung in the balance beyond Marlene's power to save. The words came from muscle memory, from childhood nights when her mother had worked 3 jobs and still found energy to read bedtime stories, from teenage years when Marlene's own mistakes had brought disappointment instead of anger. Now, when her mother needed her most, she'd failed again. The city moved around her with typical Manhattan indifference, Taxis honking at late-night fairs, couples walking arm in arm toward apartments that cost more per month than she made in 6, the distant rumble of subway trains carrying night shift workers and insomniacs through tunnels beneath the heartless streets. Steam rose from manholes like the city's own breath, and neon signs reflected off wet pavement in colors that painted the darkness but provided no warmth. Through the restaurant's golden windows, Jonathan could see her broken silhouette against the harsh streetlight, and something inside him, something that had been frozen since Rebecca's funeral, began to crack. He'd built walls of money and success around his grief, insulating himself from the messy realities of human pain. But watching this woman who'd just lost everything because she dared to show compassion, he remembered why those walls existed and what they were keeping out. Without fully realizing he was moving, Jonathan stood from his table, left $300 bills beside his untouched meal, and walked through Enzo's brass doors into the midnight air of a city that never slept but rarely dreamed. The sound of approaching footsteps on concrete made Marlene look up through tear-blurred vision. She expected to see a police officer telling her to move along, or maybe another homeless person seeking shelter in the street lamp's harsh circle of light. Instead, she found herself looking at polished Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than her former monthly salary. Jonathan Pierce stood above her, his expensive suit incongruous against the urban decay of late-night Manhattan, his face illuminated by the sickly yellow glow that made everyone look like ghosts. But his eyes, those grief-filled eyes she'd noticed during his quiet dinners, held something she hadn't expected to see there. Recognition, understanding, the look of someone who knew what it meant to fall. "Are you hurt?" His voice was softer than she'd imagined, stripped of the authority that wealth usually carried. He didn't offer empty reassurances or demand explanations. He simply asked the most basic human question, and somehow that made her tears flow harder. "I'm fine," Marlene answered automatically, the response of someone trained to minimize her own needs, to never give inconvenience or concern. But the lie tasted bitter in the cold air. And they both knew it wasn't true. Jonathan looked down at this woman who'd just lost her job for showing kindness, who was whispering comfort to a mother she couldn't save, who was sitting on concrete in 30-degree weather, clutching the remains of her professional life in a cardboard box. Nothing about her situation was fine, and the fact that she still tried to spare him discomfort spoke to a strength of character he'd forgotten existed in the world. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the sidewalk beside her. The question was so unexpected, so contrary to every social convention that governed interactions between people of their different circumstances, that Marlene could only nod. The concrete was cold through his $1,000 suit pants, and he felt the grit and dampness seeping through Italian wool. Around them, the city's night symphony continued, sirens wailing in the distance, the rumble of delivery trucks, the hiss of bus brakes, the murmur of conversations spilling from late-night bars. But in their small circle of streetlight, silence stretched between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. "I saw what you did in there," Jonathan said finally, his breath visible in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the winter air. "For that girl. Why?" The question caught Marlene off guard. In her world, kindness didn't require explanation. You helped because someone needed help, because turning away from pain was worse than having nothing to give. But she looked at this man in his expensive clothes, with his manicured hands and his grief-struck eyes, and realized he came from a place where even charity was calculated. "She reminded me of my daughter," Marlene said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. "I lost her to the system 15 years ago when I couldn't make ends meet. Someone helped me then, not because they had to, but because they could. I promised myself I'd pass it on when I got the chance." Jonathan absorbed this confession without judgment, understanding more than she realized about the weight of losing children, about the guilt that came with feeling powerless to protect the people you loved most. "What happened to her?" "Your daughter." "Foster care, then aged out of the system at 18. She's in California somewhere, trying to build a life without the mother who failed her." Marlene's voice carried 15 years of regret, of wondering if her daughter ever thought about her. If forgiveness was possible across such vast distances of time and pain. "And your mother?" Jonathan asked gently, somehow knowing there was more to the story behind her whispered words. "Cancer, stage 4, in San Juan." The words came out flat, matter of fact, the way people spoke about catastrophes too large for emotion. "There's an experimental treatment that might help, but insurance won't cover it. $80,000. I was trying to figure out how to get the money when—" She gestured toward the restaurant behind them, at the golden windows that had been her world for 8 years and now belonged to her past. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. She'd lost her ability to earn money because she'd given it away, had sacrificed her own desperate need to help someone else's. Jonathan sat in the city's cold embrace, feeling the concrete's chill seep through his clothes and into bones that had been numb for years. This woman beside him carried burdens that would have crushed people with far more resources, yet she'd just given her evening's tips to a stranger, because kindness mattered more than mathematics. The contrast to his own life, where every decision was filtered through profit margins and risk assessments, was so stark it made his chest hurt. "What will you do now?" he asked, though he suspected she was still figuring that out herself. Marlene looked up at the night sky, where stars struggled to compete with the city's electric ambition. "Find another job, I guess. Start over. Again." The words carried the weariness of someone who'd rebuilt her life multiple times, who understood that sometimes survival meant accepting that you'd never get ahead, only continue. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people from completely different worlds united by their separate griefs, and the strange intimacy that comes from sharing truth with strangers. Around them, Manhattan continued its restless dance, but for these few minutes, time seemed suspended in the harsh circle of streetlight. Eventually, the cold became too much to ignore, and Marlene struggled to her feet, her joints stiff from the concrete and the night air. Jonathan rose with her, their brief connection feeling fragile in the face of returning to their separate realities. "Thank you," Marlene said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. For sitting with her, maybe. For asking questions that let her speak her daughter's name, for seeing her as human when the rest of the world had decided she was expendable. "Thank you," Jonathan replied, meaning it in ways he couldn't explain, for showing him what courage looked like, for reminding him that compassion still existed in a world he'd thought had gone cold, for breaking something open in his chest that had been frozen since Rebecca died. They parted ways at the corner, Marlene heading toward the subway that would take her back to Washington Heights in an uncertain future, Jonathan walking toward his penthouse in the sleepless night he knew awaited him. But something had changed in those few minutes on cold concrete, something that neither of them fully understood yet, but both would carry forward into whatever came next. In the days that followed, both Marlene and Jonathan discovered that some encounters leave invisible marks that reshape everything that comes after, like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that travel much farther than anyone expects. The days after losing her job at Enzo's stretched ahead of Marlene like an unlit tunnel. Her small studio apartment in Washington Heights felt smaller with nowhere to go each morning, the silence broken only by the radiator's clanging complaints and the distant sounds of her neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls. She'd wake at 4:47 a.m. anyway, her body trained by 8 years of routine, then remember she had nowhere to be, and try to force herself back into sleep that wouldn't come. Her savings would cover exactly 6 weeks of rent if she ate nothing but rice and beans, and even then, only if no other emergencies arose. She'd filed for unemployment benefits, but the bureaucratic maze of paperwork and waiting periods felt designed to exhaust hope before providing help. Each morning brought a fresh stack of job applications filled out in her careful handwriting. Each afternoon brought form letter rejections or, worse, the silence of indifference. The phone calls with her mother became exercises in shared deception. Maria Rodriguez had raised 5 children working double shifts at a textile factory, had buried a husband at 38, had somehow managed to send her youngest daughter to community college with money that materialized from impossible mathematics. Now, weak from chemotherapy but still sharp enough to hear the strain in Marlene's voice, she asked careful questions about work, about money, about the future, with the wisdom of someone who'd learned not to push too hard on doors that might not open. "Mija, you sound tired," her mother would say, her voice carrying across the miles between Puerto Rico and New York, like a prayer wrapped in concern. "Are you eating enough? Are you taking care of yourself?" "I'm fine, Mommy," Marlene would lie, staring at the stack of overdue bills she'd arranged and rearranged on her small table, as if organizing them might somehow make the numbers add up differently. "Don't worry about me. How are you feeling? Did you eat the soup I had delivered?" These conversations became elaborate dances around the truth. Maria pretending her pain wasn't worsening, Marlene pretending her rent wasn't overdue, both protecting the other from fears they couldn't fix. The experimental treatment in San Juan might as well have been on the moon for all Marlene could reach it, but neither woman spoke that reality aloud. 3 weeks after her termination, Marlene finally found work at a coffee shop in Inwood, 30 minutes north on the A train. The pay was $8 an hour, plus tips that barely reached double digits on good days. The manager, a tired man named Carlos who spoke primarily in sighs, outlined her responsibilities with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. Serve coffee, clean tables, close up the register, mop floors. Simple work, honest work, but work that paid about a quarter of what she'd made at Enzo's. The coffee shop occupied the ground floor of a building that had seen better decades. Its windows fogged with age and its floors worn thin by thousands of footsteps seeking caffeine and shelter. The customers were neighborhood regulars, construction workers grabbing coffee before dawn shifts, elderly Dominican women who nursed single cups for hours while playing dominoes, teenagers who scraped together change for pastries after school. They were her people in ways Enzo's wealthy customers had never been, but their kindness couldn't bridge the mathematical gap between her expenses and income. Meanwhile, 43 floors above Central Park, Jonathan Pierce found himself unable to concentrate on the algorithmic trading patterns that usually consumed his attention. His office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist design, felt like a glass cage suspended above the real world where people like Marlene struggled with problems his money could solve without him noticing the expense. His company's quarterly profits had exceeded projections by 12%, adding another $14 million to his personal net worth. His investment portfolio, heavy on cryptocurrency and emerging tech markets, generated more money in passive income each month than most people earned in a year. His financial advisor had recently suggested diversifying into gold futures and European real estate, opportunities that would expand his wealth into 9 figures within the next 5 years. But wealth, he was learning, was a peculiar burden when it came with the knowledge of how little it had mattered when Rebecca lay dying. All his money couldn't buy her another day, couldn't erase the regret of missed calls and postponed dinners, couldn't restore the family that grief had fractured. And now, sitting in his leather chair while markets fluctuated in green and red on multiple screens, he couldn't stop thinking about a woman who'd lost her job because she'd chosen compassion over protocol. He found himself driving past Enzo's on Tuesday evenings, though he no longer went inside. The restaurant looked the same, brass fixtures gleaming, windows glowing with warm light, well-dressed customers raising wine glasses in celebration of deals and anniversaries. But something essential was missing, some quality of human warmth that had nothing to do with the decor or the menu. His children, Emma and Michael, noticed the change during their monthly dinner at an upscale restaurant in the Upper East Side. These meals had become stilted affairs over the past 5 years, conversations carefully avoiding the topics that mattered most while focusing on safe subjects like school grades and weekend plans. But that evening, Jonathan seemed distracted, present in body, but wrestling with thoughts that pulled his attention elsewhere. "Dad, you're not listening," Emma said, her 16-year-old directness cutting through his contemplation. "I asked if you'd come to my debate tournament next week." Jonathan looked up from the salmon he'd barely touched, seeing his daughter's face clearly for the first time in months. She had Rebecca's eyes, the same intelligent intensity that had first attracted him 20 years ago. When had he stopped really seeing her? "Of course I'll be there," he said, meaning it in ways he hadn't meant anything in years. "What time does it start?" The conversation that followed was different from their usual carefully polite exchanges. Emma talked about her debate team's preparation for regionals, about the research she'd done on income inequality, about the homeless woman she'd seen outside their school who reminded her of stories her mother used to tell about her grandmother's childhood during the Depression. Michael, 13, and still growing into the young man he'd become, shared his concerns about a classmate whose parents were getting divorced, whose lunch money had stopped coming, who'd started falling asleep in class. Their concerns, Jonathan realized, centered on the same themes that had moved Marlene to help a stranger: the recognition that some people's circumstances were harder than others, that kindness mattered when systems failed, that being able to help carried the responsibility to do so. When had his children become more compassionate than their father? That night, alone in his penthouse apartment with its panoramic views of a city that never slept, Jonathan stood at his windows, looking down at lights that represented millions of lives, millions of stories, millions of struggles he'd never bothered to consider. Somewhere out there, Marlene was probably lying awake worrying about rent money and her mother's medical bills, carrying burdens that his weekly wine budget could eliminate. The revelation came not as a dramatic epiphany, but as a quiet certainty, like watching sunrise gradually illumine a landscape that had been there all along. He'd been living his life as if wealth was meant to insulate him from the world's problems, when maybe it was meant to help solve them. Rebecca would have understood this instinctively. She'd volunteered at homeless shelters, tutored underprivileged kids, seen her privilege as a tool for service rather than separation. In his grief, he'd abandoned not just her memory, but her values. It took him 3 days to find Marlene, using resources that felt intrusive but necessary. A private investigator named Helen Martinez, who specialized in locating people rather than investigating their secrets, tracked Marlene through employment records and subway card usage. Helen was professional, but pointed in her questions about why a tech millionaire was looking for a former waitress, and Jonathan found himself explaining the situation with more honesty than he'd intended. "She helped someone and lost her job for it," he said. Sitting in Helen's cluttered office in Queens, surrounded by filing cabinets and case files that represented the city's vast catalog of human drama. "I want to help her." "Help her how?" Helen's question carried the skepticism of someone who'd seen wealthy men develop obsessions with working-class women, usually with uncomfortable endings. "Help her save her mother's life," Jonathan answered, and the simplicity of that truth seemed to satisfy Helen's concerns. The search led to the coffee shop in Inwood, where Helen observed Marlene working morning shifts with the same quiet dignity she'd shown at Enzo's. The pay was obviously inadequate. Helen could see in Marlene's carefully mended uniform, in the way she walked to save on subway fare, in the tired lines around her eyes that spoke of sleep sacrificed to worry. But her treatment of customers remained consistently kind, her movements economical but graceful, her presence somehow making the shabby coffee shop feel more welcoming than its fluorescent lights and cracked linoleum deserved. "She's working 2 jobs now," Helen reported back to Jonathan. "Morning shift at the coffee shop, evening shift cleaning office buildings in Midtown. Gets home around midnight, back up before 5 a.m. Rent's overdue, but the landlord's giving her time because she's been a good tenant for 6 years. Her mother's condition is deteriorating faster than expected." The information felt like looking at an X-ray of someone's life, revealing the hidden fractures that kept a person functional on the surface while pain spread beneath. Jonathan understood now why Marlene had whispered, "Don't cry, Mom," to the darkness. She was trying to be strong enough for both of them, carrying her mother's fear along with her own desperation. Finding her wasn't difficult once he knew where to look. The coffee shop in Inwood closed at 7 p.m., and Marlene always stayed an extra 30 minutes to complete the closing checklist that Carlos was too overwhelmed to manage properly. Jonathan arrived on a Thursday evening in late November, when the first serious cold snap had settled over the city, like an unwelcome guest who planned to stay till spring. Through the fogged windows, he could see her wiping down tables and stacking chairs, moving through familiar motions that transformed chaos into order. The coffee shop looked different from Enzo's golden elegance. Fluorescent lights couldn't compete with warm chandeliers, and cracked linoleum was a poor substitute for marble floors. But watching Marlene work, Jonathan recognized the same quality that had drawn his attention months ago. Dignity that had nothing to do with surroundings and everything to do with character. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Marlene looked up from counting register receipts with the professional smile she offered everyone who walked through those doors. Recognition dawned slowly, surprise replacing politeness as she remembered the man who'd sat with her on cold concrete outside a restaurant that now felt like part of another lifetime. "We're actually closed," she said gently, though she made no move to stop what she was doing. "But I can make you coffee if you need some." "I'm not here for coffee," Jonathan replied, his voice carrying the same quiet tone he'd used that night on the sidewalk. "I'm here because I've been thinking about what you said, about your mother, about experimental treatments and impossible mathematics." Marlene's hands stilled on the receipts, understanding beginning to dawn in her expressive eyes. Around them, the coffee shop held its breath, the refrigerator's hum, the distant traffic from Broadway, even the building settling seemed to pause in anticipation of what would happen next. "I don't accept charity," she said firmly, the words carrying 8 years of serving wealthy customers who sometimes offered condescending tips or patronizing advice. "I work for what I need." "I'm not offering charity," Jonathan replied, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw an envelope that contained more than paper and ink. It contained the possibility of miracles disguised as modern medicine. "I'm offering a job." The envelope held a contract written in language that lawyers had crafted to be both legally binding and personally meaningful. Jonathan's foundation, established that morning with a phone call to his attorney and a wire transfer that barely registered against his quarterly profits, needed someone to oversee its charitable work, someone who understood what it meant to struggle, who could identify worthy causes and ensure that help reached the people who needed it most. The salary was generous but not insulting, twice what she'd made at Enzo's, with health insurance that would cover her mother's treatments, and a signing bonus that exactly matched the cost of experimental therapy in San Juan. The work would involve travel, evaluation of grant applications, and the kind of human interaction that had always been her strength. It was legitimate employment, not disguised philanthropy, though the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. "Why?" Marlene asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she read through contract terms that offered solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. "Why would you do this?" Jonathan looked at this woman who'd lost a job for showing compassion, who worked 14-hour days for wages that wouldn't support a comfortable life, who'd given away money she couldn't spare because someone else needed it more. In her question, he heard echoes of his daughter's concerns about homeless classmates, his son's worry for friends facing family struggles, his late wife's belief that privilege carried responsibility. "Because you reminded me who I used to be," he said honestly. "Before I forgot that money is supposed to be a tool, not a wall. Before I started thinking that success meant insulation instead of connection. Before I let grief turn me into someone Rebecca wouldn't recognize." The truth hung between them like a bridge built from shared understanding of loss, of failure, of the possibility that redemption sometimes came disguised as second chances. Outside, November wind rattled the coffee shop's windows. But inside, two people from different worlds discovered that compassion could translate across any distance, that healing sometimes required helping others heal first. Marlene signed the contract with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of hope after months of despair. Within hours, medical records were being transmitted to Puerto Rico, experimental treatments were being scheduled, and a mother's prayers were being answered by her daughter's courage to show kindness to a stranger on a city sidewalk. The transformation that followed wasn't dramatic or instantaneous. Real change, both Marlene and Jonathan learned, happened in small increments, in daily choices to see beyond surfaces, in the gradual recognition that wealth and poverty were circumstances rather than identities, and that dignity could flourish in any soil when watered with respect. Spring arrived in New York with its usual mixture of promise and unpredictability. Steam rose from manholes like the city's own hopeful breath, while construction crews emerged from winter hibernation to dig new hope into old foundations. Cherry trees bloomed in Central Park, their delicate flowers offering proof that beauty could emerge from the harshest conditions, given enough time and the right circumstances. Marlene's mother, Maria Rodriguez, had responded better than anyone dared expect to the experimental treatment in San Juan. The cancer hadn't disappeared. Miracles, the doctors explained gently, were rare even with cutting-edge therapy. But it had retreated enough to buy time, to allow for conversations that had seemed forever lost, to permit the slow healing of relationships that distance and fear had frayed. Maria was strong enough now to travel, and her first airplane ride brought her to LaGuardia Airport on a bright April morning where her daughter waited with tears of profound gratitude. Their reunion in the arrivals terminal was witnessed by hundreds of strangers rushing toward their own destinations. But for Marlene and Maria, the world contracted to encompass only the embrace they'd thought might never come. Maria looked smaller than Marlene remembered, worn thin by illness and treatment, but her eyes held the same intelligent warmth that had guided her daughter through childhood's hardships and adult disappointments. "Mija," Maria whispered, her arms surprisingly strong as they wrapped around the daughter who'd somehow found a way to move mountains with love and borrowed hope. "You look different, happier." Marlene did look different. The constant tension that had pinched her features during her final months at Enzo's had dissolved into something softer, but no less determined. Her work with Jonathan's foundation had taken her to homeless shelters and community centers, to immigrant service organizations and job training programs, to places where her experience with struggle translated into wisdom that funding alone couldn't provide. She'd learned to navigate the complex ecosystem of charitable work, to distinguish between organizations that served their communities and those that served their administrators' salaries. Her recommendations carried weight because they came from genuine understanding rather than theoretical compassion, and the Foundation's grants began to develop a reputation for reaching people who'd fallen through the cracks of larger, more established programs. The Foundation's offices occupied a modest brownstone in Harlem, deliberately chosen for its accessibility to the communities they served rather than its proximity to Manhattan's power centers. Jonathan had wanted something that felt like a neighborhood resource rather than an institution, and Marlene had found former colleagues from the service industry to staff positions that required both professional skills and personal understanding of economic insecurity. Carlos from the Inwood coffee shop now managed the Foundation's small business loan program, helping restaurant workers and retailers access capital for ventures that traditional banks considered too risky. Jessica, the former Enzo's hostess whose call had cost Marlene her job, had surprisingly contacted the Foundation looking for work, humbled by her own experience of unemployment and motivated by genuine remorse to do better. "I was wrong," Jessica had said during her interview, sitting across from Marlene in an office that overlooked a community garden where children played between rows of vegetables their families would harvest. "I was scared of losing my job, so I threw you under the bus to protect myself. I've thought about it every day since then." Marlene had hired her anyway, recognizing the courage it took to seek forgiveness and the value of employing someone whose understanding of a workplace dynamics came from personal failure rather than academic theory. Jessica's work with employment placement programs carried an authenticity that opened doors and built trust in communities where hope had been repeatedly disappointed. Jonathan's own transformation had been quieter, but no less significant. His Tuesday evening dinners with Emma and Michael had evolved from stilted obligations into genuine conversations about their dreams, their concerns, and their growing awareness of how privilege could be wielded for good rather than simply enjoyed. Emma's debate team had won the regional championship with arguments about income inequality that drew from her father's work with the foundation, while Michael had started tutoring younger students whose families couldn't afford private help. The penthouse apartment that had once felt like elegant isolation now served as a gathering place where his children brought friends who were learning that wealth could be welcoming rather than intimidating. Rebecca's memory lived in these moments of connection, her values finally finding expression through the family she'd left behind. On a warm evening in May, the foundation hosted its first annual gala in the community center, where Jonathan had first found Marlene serving soup to families in need. The event was deliberately different from the charity galas that filled Manhattan ballrooms with wealthy donors more interested in tax deductions than social impact. Instead of champagne and catered delicacies, they served food prepared by graduates of their culinary training program. And instead of silent auctions featuring luxury items, they offered stories, real accounts of lives changed through targeted assistance and genuine respect. Marlene stood at a modest podium, looking out at a crowd that included former co-workers from Enzo's, neighbors from Washington Heights, foundation clients who'd become colleagues, and donors whose checkbooks had learned to follow their hearts. Her dress was simple but elegant, purchased from a boutique owned by a foundation grant recipient who specialized in affordable clothing for working women. She wore no jewelry except her mother's wedding ring, passed down that morning as a symbol of continuity across generations of women who'd learned to find strength in service. 2 years ago, Marlene began, her voice carrying clearly through speakers that had been donated by an electronics retailer whose expansion loan the foundation had guaranteed. I lost a job for helping someone I didn't know. At the time, it felt like the end of everything: my income, my security, my ability to help my dying mother. I fell to my knees on a sidewalk outside a restaurant, convinced that kindness was a luxury I couldn't afford. She paused, finding Jonathan's face in the crowd, seeing Emma and Michael beside him with expressions of pride that made her remember her own daughter's face 17 years ago, before circumstances had pulled their family apart. Maria sat in the front row, her presence a daily miracle that medical statistics had suggested was unlikely. But I was wrong about kindness, Marlene continued. It's not a luxury. It's not something we can afford or not afford. It's the foundation everything else is built on. Without it, money is just paper, success is just noise, and all our achievements are just elaborate ways of avoiding the truth that we need each other. The applause that followed wasn't the polite recognition common at such events, but the genuine appreciation of people who'd experienced both cruelty and compassion, who understood the difference between charity that condescended and generosity that honored. In that moment, the community center felt like what it was, a place where dignity was both practiced and preserved, where help flowed in all directions, where everyone had something to offer and something to receive. Later, as the evening wound down and volunteers stacked chairs while sharing stories and laughter, Jonathan found Marlene in the kitchen, washing dishes alongside her mother and a group of teenagers from the neighborhood youth program. The sight was so familiar and yet so transformed. Here was the same woman who'd served his table at Enzo's, still working with her hands, still caring for others. But now her service was chosen rather than required, appreciated rather than taken for granted, part of a larger community effort rather than solitary labor. "Any regrets?" he asked, picking up a dish towel and joining the impromptu cleanup crew, his expensive shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows like a neighborhood volunteer rather than a foundation board member. Marlene considered the question while rinsing a pot that had held rice and beans prepared by a former gang member who'd learned to cook through their job training program. Around them, conversations flowed in Spanish and English, laughter echoed off institutional walls, and the ordinary magic of shared work transformed cleanup into celebration. "Just one," she said, her smile carrying the warmth that had first caught his attention in a restaurant where she'd been invisible to nearly everyone. "I regret that it took losing everything to discover what I actually had. But maybe that's how it works sometimes. Maybe you have to fall down before you learn how to help other people stand up." Outside, New York's springtime energy hummed through streets where millions of stories intersected daily, where kindness and cruelty competed for space, where people like Marlene Rodriguez and Jonathan Pierce learned that the distance between service and servitude was measured not in dollars or status, but in dignity, respect, and the recognition that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserved to be seen as human. The Foundation's work continued, expanding to other cities where former servers and retail workers and hotel housekeepers identified communities that needed support and individuals whose potential was constrained by circumstances rather than ability. Each new program carried Marlene's understanding that the most effective help came from those who'd needed it themselves, who knew the difference between assistance that empowered and aid that diminished. And sometimes, when the work was especially difficult or the problem seemed too large for any foundation to address, Marlene would remember a cold November night when she'd whispered comfort to her dying mother on a sidewalk outside a restaurant. She'd learned that night that falling down wasn't failure. It was the position from which all rising began, the place where pride released its useless grip and allowed love to do the lifting. In the end, her story became what she'd always hoped it could be, not a tale of rescue or salvation, but a reminder that dignity belonged to everyone, that service was honor rather than humiliation, and that the distance between a penthouse and a sidewalk was much shorter than it appeared when measured by the only currency that truly mattered: the recognition that everyone's humanity deserved respect, everyone's struggle deserved witnessing, and everyone's capacity for both giving and receiving love made them worthy of being seen. The years that followed brought the ordinary miracles that accumulate when people choose connection over isolation, service over self-protection, and hope over the easier cynicism that guards against disappointment. Maria Rodriguez lived to see her granddaughter graduate from college, a reunion made possible by the Foundation's Family Reunification Program. Emma Pierce became a civil rights lawyer specializing in workers' rights, while Michael started a nonprofit organization focused on supporting children aging out of foster care. And somewhere in California, a young woman named Sofia Rodriguez saw her mother's face on a foundation website and finally found the courage to make a phone call that bridged 15 years of silence and regret. These weren't the endings that movies promise or fairy tales deliver. There were no dramatic declarations of love, no last-minute rescues, no moments when everything suddenly made perfect sense. Instead, there was the quieter satisfaction of problems addressed rather than ignored, of wounds healing over time, of ordinary people discovering that their capacity for both giving and receiving love was far greater than they'd imagined possible. The call came on a Tuesday, exactly 2 years after that night on the sidewalk. Marlene was in her office reviewing applications for the Foundation's new scholarship program when her assistant knocked hesitantly and explained that someone was asking for her, someone who claimed to be her daughter. The words hit Marlene like a physical blow, 28 years of grief and hope and desperate love colliding in her chest as she reached for the phone with trembling hands. "Mom?" The voice was older now, seasoned by experiences Marlene had never been allowed to share. But it carried undertones that took her back to bedtime stories and scraped knees and the fierce protective love she'd felt from the moment Sophia had been placed in her arms. "I saw the Foundation website. I saw your picture. I I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me." What followed was the most important conversation of Marlene's life. Two women bridging a canyon of lost time with careful words and tentative hope. Sophia had built a good life in San Diego, working as a social worker specializing in family preservation, ironically spending her career trying to keep other families together after her own had been torn apart by circumstances beyond anyone's control. She'd married a kind man named David, had 2 children who'd grown up hearing stories about a grandmother they'd never met, but who'd loved them from a distance they couldn't understand. "I was angry for so long," Sophia admitted, her voice carrying across the continent with the honesty that only comes from years of therapy and self-reflection. "I thought you'd given up on me. I didn't understand how hard you'd tried until I had my own children, until I realized what it must have cost you to let me go because you couldn't provide what I needed." The reunion took place in the same community center where the foundation had held its gala, Sophia flying cross-country with her family to meet the grandmother who'd never stopped praying for them, and the mother whose love had survived 15 years of separation and guilt. Maria Rodriguez, now 82 and walking with a cane but still sharp enough to recognize the miracle happening before her eyes, held her great-grandchildren, while Sophia and Marlene navigated the complex geography of reconnection. "You look like her," Maria whispered to 8-year-old Isabella, Sophia's daughter, whose dark eyes and stubborn chin carried the genetic memory of women who'd learned to be strong because circumstances demanded it. "You have the same spirit. I can see it in how you ask questions about everything." Jonathan watched the reunion from a respectful distance, understanding that some moments belong to families alone. But later, as the evening evolved into an impromptu celebration, with neighbors and foundation staff and anyone who'd become part of their extended chosen family, he found himself thinking about Rebecca and the children they'd raised together, and the way love could survive even death when it was rooted in something deeper than possession or proximity. Emma, now 21 and in her final year at Columbia Law School, sat with Sophia's teenage son Alex, sharing stories about growing up with parents whose work involved helping others, about the peculiar burden and blessing of privilege, about the way service could either isolate you from real connection or become the bridge that made authentic community possible. Michael, now 18 and headed to college in the fall, played guitar while Maria sang old songs in Spanish that her great-grandchildren were learning phonetically, creating new traditions that honored the past while building toward a future none of them could have imagined. As the evening deepened and the community center filled with that particular warmth that comes when boundaries dissolve and people remember that they belong to each other, Marlene found herself standing in the doorway, watching the scene unfold with a gratitude so profound it felt like prayer. Her mother, alive and laughing at something one of the children had said. Her daughter, finally home in all the ways that mattered. Jonathan's children, treating Sophia's family like the cousins they'd chosen to be. Former Enzo's colleagues mixing with foundation clients, mixing with neighbors from Washington Heights, all of them discovering that the artificial divisions that usually separated their worlds had been constructed from fear rather than necessity. This was what she'd been searching for all her life without knowing it. Not just survival, not just getting by, not just making it through another day, but the recognition that her life had meaning beyond the sum of her struggles, that her capacity to love and be loved was the most valuable thing she could offer the world, that dignity didn't have to be earned or granted, but could be claimed and practiced and shared until it multiplied beyond calculation. The foundation continued to grow, but growth measured in depth rather than breadth, in the quality of relationships rather than quantity of programs, in the understanding that sustainable change happened when people who'd been helped became helpers, when victims became advocates, when those who'd been served learned to serve. Carlos opened his own restaurant employing recent immigrants and single mothers and anyone who needed a second chance. Jessica married a man she'd met at a foundation job fair, someone whose understanding of economic insecurity matched her own and whose kindness had taught her that vulnerability was strength rather than weakness. David Chen, the former manager of Enzo's, approached the foundation 2 years later, asking if they could help him start a restaurant worker advocacy organization. He'd been thinking, he explained, about that night when he'd had to fire Marlene for showing compassion, about how the industry's unforgiving economics often forced good people to make choices that betrayed their values, about whether there might be a way to create workplaces that honored both profitability and humanity. "I was wrong," he told Marlene during their meeting in the foundation's conference room, his words echoing Jessica's earlier confession, but carrying their own weight of recognition and remorse. "I was so focused on protecting the restaurant's reputation that I forgot what reputation should actually mean. A place where kindness gets punished isn't worth protecting." The Restaurant Worker Organization became one of the foundation's most successful programs, not because it solved all the industry's problems, but because it created spaces where dignity was non-negotiable, where serving others was recognized as skilled and valuable work, where people like Marlene could build careers rather than just survive jobs. David's own journey from manager to advocate became a case study in how institutions could change when the people running them remembered their humanity. Some evenings, when the foundation's offices were quiet and the city settled into its restless nighttime rhythm, Marlene would walk the few blocks from Harlem to Central Park, retracing in reverse the journey that had brought Jonathan into her life. The park at night was different from the harsh streets where she'd fallen that November evening, softer, quieter, filled with the sounds of people enjoying rather than enduring their circumstances. She'd sit on a bench overlooking the reservoir and think about the peculiar mathematics of grace, the way kindness multiplied rather than diminished when it was shared, the recognition that help flowed both ways even when it appeared to move in only one direction. Jonathan found her there one Tuesday evening, almost 3 years to the day after their first meeting outside Enzo's. He'd been walking home from a late dinner with Emma and Michael, both of whom were now working in different cities, but still came home regularly, drawn by the warmth their father had learned to create rather than the wealth he'd accumulated. The penthouse apartment had been sold the previous year, replaced by a smaller place in Brooklyn Heights that felt more like a home than a monument to success. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench with the easy familiarity of someone who'd become family through choice rather than obligation. Marlene considered the question while watching joggers circle the reservoir, their reflections rippling in water that held the city's lights like liquid diamonds. Around them, New York continued its eternal dance of ambition and dreams. But here, in this pocket of green space, time moved more slowly, allowing for the kind of reflection that daily life usually crowded out. "None," she said finally, and meant it in ways she couldn't have imagined when she'd first whispered those words to her dying mother on cold concrete. Even the hardest parts led somewhere necessary. Even losing Sophia taught me something about letting go that I needed to understand before I could learn how to hold on properly. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned that the most profound conversations often happened in the spaces between words, when presence mattered more than explanation. The city stretched around them in all directions, millions of stories unfolding simultaneously, millions of people learning their own lessons about dignity and service, and the complicated arithmetic of love. "Want to know a secret?" Jonathan asked, his voice carrying the quiet humor that had replaced the bitter grief that once defined him. "That night when I saw you fall, when I decided to leave the restaurant and sit with you, I wasn't trying to help you. I was trying to save myself. I'd been dying slowly for 5 years, and watching your kindness reminded me what being alive actually felt like." Marlene nodded, understanding more than he realized about the way rescue worked in both directions, about how the people we think we're helping often turn out to be the ones helping us, about the recognition that human connection was less about strong people lifting up weak people and more about people finding strength together they couldn't access alone. Years continued to pass, bringing the ordinary challenges and extraordinary moments that make up any life lived with intention and hope. The foundation expanded internationally, with programs in Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Central America, all guided by Marlene's principle that the most effective help came from people who understood struggle from the inside out. Sophia relocated to New York to direct the Family Services Division, bringing her husband and children into what had become an ever-expanding network of chosen family, bound together by shared values rather than shared genetics. Maria Rodriguez lived to be 91, long enough to see her great-grandchildren starting school, long enough to watch her daughter receive an honorary doctorate from Columbia University for her work in community development, long enough to understand that the experimental treatment that had saved her life had been just the beginning of miracles that kept multiplying in directions no one could have predicted. Her funeral was held in the same community center where the foundation had celebrated its victories, attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of one woman's kindness to a stranger outside a restaurant. At the service, Marlene spoke about her mother with the same quiet dignity that had characterized everything else in her adult life. She talked about lessons learned in childhood kitchens where love was measured in extra portions and patient corrections, about the courage it took to raise children while working multiple jobs, about the faith required to believe that kindness mattered even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. She taught me that dignity isn't something you can lose, Marlene said, looking out at a congregation that included tech millionaires and former homeless clients, civil rights lawyers and restaurant workers, teenagers from the Foundation's scholarship program, and elderly neighbors from Washington Heights. It's something you practice every day in how you treat yourself and others. It's something you choose, especially when choosing it costs you something you think you can't afford to give. The years that followed brought their own lessons about grief and healing, about the way love persists even after the people we love are gone, about the recognition that the best way to honor the dead is to live fully in service to the living. Marlene's hair turned gray, then silver, but her eyes retained the warmth that had first drawn Jonathan's attention in a restaurant where she'd been invisible to nearly everyone else. Her hands, scarred by years of service in kitchens and dining rooms, learned new skills: how to write grant proposals and review budgets, how to comfort grieving families and celebrate victories, how to hold space for other people's pain while maintaining hope for solutions that hadn't been discovered yet. The Foundation's work evolved with the changing needs of the communities it served, addressing gentrification and immigration policy, workforce development and educational equity, mental health and environmental justice. But regardless of the specific issue, every program was guided by the same principle that had emerged from that November night on a Manhattan sidewalk: that everyone deserved to be seen as fully human, that dignity was non-negotiable, that service was honor rather than obligation when it flowed from love rather than duty. Jonathan's children grew into adults who carried their parents' values into their own work and relationships. Emma's legal practice specialized in workers' rights and housing advocacy, while Michael's nonprofit organization had expanded nationally, providing support to young people aging out of foster care. Both had learned from their father's example that wealth was most valuable when it was used to create opportunities for others to build their own prosperity and security. And sometimes, on quiet Tuesday evenings when the Foundation's offices were empty and the city settled into its nighttime rhythms, Marlene would find herself thinking about that young woman who'd stumbled into Enzo's Italian kitchen, desperate for shelter and kindness. She'd never learned her name, never discovered what became of her after that night. But she understood now that some acts of service plant seeds that grow in directions we never see, creating forests of possibility that extend far beyond our capacity to track or measure. The girl had reminded Marlene of her daughter, had triggered the impulse to help that cost Marlene her job, but ultimately led to work that gave her life meaning beyond survival. That single moment of compassion had created a chain reaction that touched thousands of lives, funded millions in grants, reunited families, created businesses, supported education, provided health care, built communities. None of it could have been predicted or planned. All of it had emerged from the simplest human recognition that everyone deserved kindness, especially when they couldn't pay for it. On the 5th anniversary of the Foundation's first gala, now an annual celebration that filled multiple venues across the 5 boroughs, Marlene stood once again at a podium, looking out at faces that represented the full spectrum of New York's diversity. Some were familiar. Colleagues and clients who'd become friends, relatives who'd become chosen family, donors who'd learned that generosity was more satisfying than accumulation. Others were new, recent immigrants learning English, teenagers aging out of foster care, formerly incarcerated individuals building new lives, elderly people whose fixed incomes hadn't kept pace with rising costs. 10 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through speakers that had been paid for by a foundation grant to a community radio station. I lost a job for helping someone I didn't know. Tonight, I want to talk about the job I found because of it, not the work I do now, though I love it, but the job we all share, the work of seeing each other as fully human and acting on what that recognition requires. She paused, scanning the crowd until she found Sophia's face, then Alex and Isabella, now teenagers themselves and active in the Foundation's youth leadership program. She saw Jonathan sitting with Emma and Michael, 3 generations of a family that had learned to define wealth by the depth of their connections rather than the balance of their bank accounts. She saw Maria's empty chair in the front row, still reserved in her honor, surrounded by former Enzo's colleagues and Washington Heights neighbors and Foundation clients who'd become staff members themselves. The young woman who came into the restaurant that night taught me something I'd forgotten during all my years of struggling to make ends meet, Marlene continued. She reminded me that kindness isn't a luxury we can choose to afford or not afford. It's the foundation everything else is built on. Without it, money is just paper, success is just noise, and all our achievements are just elaborate ways of avoiding the truth that we need each other. The applause that followed was different from the polite recognition common at such events. It was the sound of people who'd experienced both cruelty and compassion, who understood the difference between charity that condescended and generosity that honored, who'd learned that the distance between helping and being helped was much shorter than it appeared to those who'd never needed assistance or never been in a position to provide it. Later, as the evening wound down and volunteers cleaned up while sharing stories and laughter, Marlene found herself in the kitchen again, washing dishes alongside a new generation of teenagers from the Foundation's youth program. The scene was familiar, yet transformed, the same work, the same commitment to service, but now carried out by young people who understood from the beginning that dignity was something you practiced rather than something you earned, that everyone had something to offer and something to receive, that the most effective help came from those who'd needed it themselves. "Any regrets?" Jessica asked, now the Foundation's executive director, approaching with a dish towel and a smile that had lost the desperate edge it once carried when she'd been afraid of losing a job that barely paid her bills. "Just one," Marlene replied, the same answer she'd given Jonathan years earlier, but with deeper understanding now of what it meant. "I regret that it took losing everything to discover what I actually had. But maybe that's how it works sometimes. Maybe you have to fall down before you learn how to help other people stand up. Maybe you have to lose your footing before you can learn to walk on solid ground." Outside, New York City lights painted the darkness with the colors of dreams and ambition, of struggles and victories, of the millions of stories unfolding simultaneously in apartments and offices, restaurants and schools, community centers, and family kitchens where people were learning their own lessons about resilience and service, dignity and love. And you, listening to this story wherever you are, whether you're serving tables or managing offices, raising children or caring for parents, building businesses or rebuilding after setbacks, you already know what Marlene learned that night on the sidewalk outside Enzo's Italian kitchen. You know that dignity isn't granted by others, it's claimed by you. You know that service is noble work when it flows from choice rather than desperation. You know that the kindness you show to others creates ripples you may never see, but that travel much farther than any of us can imagine. Have you ever fallen to your knees on life's sidewalk, wondering if compassion was a luxury you couldn't afford? Have you ever given away more than you had because someone else needed it more than you could spare it? Have you ever discovered that the moment you thought was your ending was actually your beginning? That losing everything taught you what you actually had? That falling down was the position from which all rising began? Tell me your story in the comments below. Your experiences matter, your voice deserves to be heard, and your kindness creates the kind of community we all need. Every act of service, no matter how small it seems, plants seeds that grow in directions you may never see, but that extend far beyond your capacity to track or measure. If this story touched something in your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who might need to remember their own worth today. Subscribe to our channel, because every week we share stories that honor the dignity of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply by refusing to let the world's hardness harden their hearts. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with me today. Remember, you are seen, you matter, your struggle deserves witnessing, and your capacity for both giving and receiving love makes you worthy of being fully, completely, beautifully human.